you
How
think?
would you respond to a friend who says, I don't like the God of the Old Testament, and I'm so glad I have Jesus who forgives me, referring to the strict Levitical laws and God's immediate discipline of those who break the law?
Um, okay. Well, it's interesting the way the question is put or the comment is put. I don't like the God of the Old Testament. Now, what they didn't say is, I don't like what God did in the Old Testament. Because if you say it the second way, you're acknowledging that it's the same God in both Testaments. God is still God. But the way things happen in the Old Testament, yuck, I get that. But they said, I don't like the God of the Old Testament. Now, it might be helpful to ask for clarification. And that is, it's interesting the way you put that, and I'm curious what you meant. Are you suggesting that the God of the Old Testament is not the same God as the God of the New Testament? Or he's not the God who became a man in Jesus? I don't know if that's what they mean, but sometimes that is what people mean. In fact, one of the earliest heresies, was it Marcion? One of the very earliest heresies was this view that the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament are two different characters, and whatever's Jewish is out of the canon. Whole Old Testament is gone, and all the Jewish stuff, anything that looked Jewish, is taken out of the New Testament canon. Okay, that was a very early heresy, and one the church had to deal with because God is God. He gives one covenant, and then he replaces it with a different covenant. The first one's called the Mosaic covenant or the Old Covenant, and the next one's called the New Covenant. And it's new because it's new. It replaces the old, and it does what the old is not capable of doing. And that is, gives us the Holy Spirit that empowers us to keep what's right and wrong. And yes, God did act severely in the Hebrew Scriptures because he's communicating something about his character and about the importance of obedience. All right. And incidentally, those people got judged in the Old Testament under that economy in a very severe way in this life. But it's clear in the New Testament that the judgment is also going to happen in the next life, and that judgment is the judgment of fire and brimstone, the lake of fire, Revelations 20, that lasts forever. So, in a certain sense, the judgment of the God of the New Testament is much more severe than the judgment of the so-called God of the Old Testament. It's the same God. There are just different things that are going on. So I would ask the question, why would you think they're two different, or do you think they're two different gods? Or are you just saying, gee, I'm glad I don't live under that law? Now, of course, in a certain sense, we don't live under the old covenant, but we still live under moral obligation, which we violate, and we're vulnerable to God's judgment forever, Revelation 20, even in this time. So in some ways, things haven't changed. If you were a righteous person in the Old Testament, righteous in human terms, following the dictates of the law as best you could, as opposed to totally rebelling against God, you didn't get fried or blown up or buried by rocks or anything like that. There were godly people in the Old Testament and the believing remnant. So there was no threat to them as long as they followed the kinds of things that God told them to do. And many did. And actually, I'm reading through Second Chronicles right now, and there is a lot of screwy kings. The northern kingdom, there were no good ones. The ones that get me are the southern kingdom, where you had good ones and bad ones and good ones and bad ones. And you had good kings that had lousy sons, and you had lousy kings that had good sons. And even the ones that had Hezekiah, I'm thinking, I mean, some of these guys, they did pretty well, and then they ended poorly. And then their son doubles down. And when they end poorly, it's not just they end poorly, they get their butt kicked by God for ending poorly. And then their son doubles down and does even worse. And you think, I keep writing in pencil in my margin, what an idiot. What an idiot. Here's another idiot. How could they keep doing the same stupid stuff that got them beaten up in the past? So in one case, you've got a king that does wrong. So God says, I'm going to bring this Assyrians against you. And then the Syrians come and defeat them. Instead of saying, oh, God was right, I better not do this anymore, he starts sacrificing to the gods of the Assyrians. And he said, well, they beat me, so they must be the real God. Even though God told them the Assyrians are going to beat you because I'm the real God. Okay, like I said, idiots, all right? But what I keep seeing over and over again, even with these stupid, ridiculous, idiotic gods, not just the high places there, but other things they're doing, and God still is gracious to them and kind to them for the sake of David many times, not for their sake, but you see a massive amount of grace that's manifest in the Hebrew Scriptures there. And it's there all the time. It's the same God of grace. And in the New Testament, you've got all kinds of, look at Ananias and Sapphira, bang, just like that. You know, what Acts
That's
3 or
right.
4, and down they went and out they went, And so you've got, you look at the book of Revelation, all kinds of things that are going to happen. This is not a pretty picture. It's a lot more dramatic than anything that we saw in the Old Testament, except for maybe the flood. So you have God's grace manifest in both Testaments and his anger and hostility manifest in both Testaments. They are not two gods. It's the same God. If what a person wants to say is, I'm glad I'm living now rather than then, okay, I get it. All right? Nothing wrong with that. But if they're implying that somehow God has changed, that is not the case. That is not the testimony of the text.
I think it would help to help them understand how all these pieces fit together. Because one thing that might throw a lot of people off is just the fact that they had this law in the Old Testament, and that's because God was creating a nation. This was their
Right.
constitution.
Mhm.
That's what he was doing at that particular time, but that doesn't encapsulate all that God was doing in relationship with them. I mean, just start back with Adam and Eve. Already God is talking about overcoming the evil one right
Mhm.
away. He's already starting to work his whole plan of redemption. And then you come to, obviously, you come to like the judges, and you come to all those things, and you see God graciously forgiving and continuing to guide them and lead them and all those sorts of things. But the law can be very confusing to people because they don't really understand that God was creating a nation.
Mhm.
And we have laws now too. And guess what? If you break those laws, you go to jail.
Right.
So that wasn't what was governing God's relationships with people, because when you look at the people who were gods, like Abraham and David, they both sinned, but they were considered righteous and their sins weren't counted against them because of their faith in God. And all this time, God was in relationship with people because of their faith, by his grace, because he was looking ahead to when Jesus would pay the penalty. And in fact, this is part of what the law did. The law was pointing people towards forgiveness on the basis of sacrifice. He set up the whole sacrificial system, which was meant to point to Jesus, who would fulfill all of that. So even in the law, you're seeing God's grace because he made a way for them to be forgiven and to be
Right.
made holy.
Right.
And that all was going on in the law. And the promise to Abraham was always by grace. And David was by God's grace. You know, he promised the covenant. He promised that he would bring about this king who would be there forever, which was Jesus. God fulfilled that.
Mhm.
David wasn't perfect. David sinned. So you see God's grace all the way through here. You see the one plan of Jesus dying, affecting even people back then, affecting even Abraham,
Mhm.
affecting even Adam and Eve. All, God overlooked the sin because he was waiting for the time when his whole plan would come together and Jesus would die on the cross and cover the sins of all the people who would have faith. So this is one story. This is not two separate stories. God was doing the same thing throughout. If you read Galatians, you'll see everything God says about the law through Paul there. And he says that God made a promise to Abraham. The law didn't come until 430 years later.
That's right.
And it didn't nullify the promise because the promise was always by grace. And he talks about how the law leads us to Christ so that we can be joined to Christ by faith, by God's grace. So if you're interested in seeing how the law all works together, I think Galatians covers a lot of this.
Yeah, it does. Also, we have a teaching series called the Bible Fast Forward that will it doesn't get a lot of press with us. It's been around for a while. It's 8 50-minute sessions with a huge syllabus that comes with it. You print it out, but it's 150 pages long. So my entire teaching outline is available there. But this is the tool, I think, that will help you see how these fit together. I mean, it takes 8 sessions to kind of work through the material and the history of the nation of Israel as it unfolds. And there's the 10 major historical events of Israel that help you have a backbone of the history, starting with the call of Abraham and ending with the advent of Messiah. And then you kind of see these details in the history and then how these different covenants are working themselves out. The Mosaic covenant and then ultimately the new covenant. Those are the key ones. There are others, but those are the key ones. And you're right, the Mosaic covenant was meant in part to provide a constitution of sorts for the nation of Israel. It was not just spiritual, it's not just religious, it was political as well. They were all combined in the theocracy. This is a piece that will help, I think, put that into perspective for people that are trying to understand how they all relate.
And one last thing about God striking people down, because there are places like when they're moving the ark and they touch the ark against God's rule. And you mentioned Ananias and Sapphira. God struck them down because they lied to the Holy Spirit. These are all examples of God's holiness. Is not... I think today we've lost a lot of sense of God's holiness. We think of him as our friend and our buddy, and we don't really think about
sweetheart.
Think about all of the cathedrals and the sense of awe and reverence and holiness that you get in those. God had to help them to see that was the case. So when he struck people down for either rebelling against him or ignoring the fact that they were unholy and he was holy, he did that to reveal that. Now, what this should do to us is not think, oh, well, now he's relaxed those things. Now he's not so hard on people who do those things. No, the fact is that should make us even more amazed at the fact that we are holy in Jesus. That all those rules and laws about holiness and all those things they had to do, Jesus has made us holy. He has cleansed us. He has done those things. It's not that God no longer cares about his holiness. It's not that we no longer are unworthy to be in his presence. It's that Jesus has done this great thing of bringing us together with God. And so that has not changed. So rather, anyway, I think we just need to remember that we learn many important things about God in the Old Testament that helps us to appreciate the grace that we see in the New Testament.
Right.